Good morning, disability and aging and other Medicaid advocate friends. We have made it to another Friday. This week was a huge, big week. There was a lot of in-district meetings. We're going to talk about all the things that people across the state have done and some of the articles and other things that resulted from all of your work this week. And we're going to talk about another big week coming up next week because after Wednesday, things have changed. I'm just going to preface this by saying we, in the beginning part of February, were successful in slowing the train down, and that bought us a lot of time, which was really important for more and more people to understand that these cuts are real and what they would mean. Now we're entering another period where I think we can start seeing things start to shift and change a lot more quickly. And I kind of think about this like a game of tennis. You hit the ball over the net and everybody runs to after the ball, and then the other side responds, pivots, and hits the ball back to you. And that's going to keep going back and forth as advocates and constituents talk about their concerns and try to influence the decision making of their legislators, and legislators kind of think about what they're hearing and come up with a response, because some of them are very supportive and they don't want to make cuts, and others are looking for a reason to do so, and they're responding to constituents in a way to justify those choices. So we're going to see back and forth until somebody drops the ball, and it's not going to be us, right? So I know you feel like you've been doing a lot of stuff, because you have, and unfortunately, we need to keep doing all of these things until Congress decides that Medicaid cuts really just aren't worth it to them. Here's this terrifying slide again that has all sorts of things on it. There's a couple of updates. First, we moved the star. So now we are in the week of February 17th, and there's been some things that have happened. We have two bills that are moving forward at the same time. And we'll talk about both. The first is the Senate has a reconciliation bill. They voted yesterday to accept the blueprint for that reconciliation bill, and that bill is moving forward. Remember, the Senate has a two-bill plan. So this is the smaller of the reconciliation bills, and it is intended to fund border and security, but it also tells the Senate Health and Education Committee, which our Senator Tammy Baldwin serves on, to make at least a set amount of cuts. So health, that includes Medicaid. Education, that includes the Department of Education. And both of those things are important to people with disabilities. So it is something to watch, because it is a potential path that Medicaid cuts and other cuts could happen. Overall, the amount of cutting for this smaller bill is much less than the bill that we are really going to talk about and focus on today. But it's still important. Anytime you're talking about $175 billion with a B, that's a lot of money. And we will start seeing that bill move forward in the coming weeks. At the same time, perhaps that the House starts thinking about moving its much bigger package, which we're convinced will include Medicaid cuts. And we'll spend most of our time talking about that today. Just a little bit of, encouragement. We do have Congress's attention. They are aware, because many, many people like yourselves have been contacting them, have been meeting with them, have been visiting their offices and their town halls and their listening sessions. They're aware that people are concerned about Medicaid cuts, and that there are enough Republicans who are aware that people are not supportive of Medicaid cuts, that they are worried if they vote for cuts, that voters may hold them accountable for that, and they could lose their jobs. So there have been several articles that have come out that are talking about this group of Republicans, and we'll talk about Republican. They are in the majority, and the majority really does get to set what the agenda is. It's a narrow majority in the House. There's 218 Republicans and I think 217 Democrats. So they only need one or two votes to go a different direction. And, then the majority party can't actually move forward its agenda. So it's a narrow majority, and there are lots of moderate Republicans who have been expressing concerns behind the scenes. It's important to know that expressing concerns behind the scenes doesn't necessarily mean supporting Medicaid. It does mean that they understand that Medicaid cuts have a consequence to their districts that they don't like, and that they see those consequences as being impactful to them. So here's the big news that happened this week with the House. Remember, the House has a one bill reconciliation strategy, and that means they're trying to put all of the cuts that they want to fund the border, to extend the president's 2017 tax cuts, everything in one bill. So it's a much larger bill that will have to do more things because they're trying to do more things. That bill we discussed last week has a $2 trillion, that is what they want to cut. That is the number that the one bill plan has assigned as we're trying to cut $2 trillion from the existing federal budget, reduce federal spending by $2 trillion. And they have assigned various committees to make cuts of at least, and they insert a certain amount. This plan has assigned the committee that oversees Medicaid to cut at least $880 billion from the things that it oversees. Everybody at the national level says that high number means Medicaid cuts, and probably at close to that number, which means that many of the Medicaid cut ideas that we have been talking about, they have to do many or all of them to get to that number, okay? The other important thing to know is that $2 trillion, that's the overall cuts that this bill would say has to happen. When you add up all the numbers from all the committees that got told, okay, you need to cut at least this much, that doesn't add up to $2 trillion. It adds up to $1.5 trillion. What that means is that there's an extra $500 billion in cuts that has to be found from somewhere. And most national watchers think that that extra $500 billion, a good portion of it, or maybe all of it, might be coming from the Medicaid program too. So $880 billion, you think of that as the minimum for what they might cut Medicaid, and then add onto it maybe as much as $500 billion more, which puts you at, my math is hard, it's Friday morning, $1.3 trillion potentially coming from Medicaid. So this is a big deal. On Tuesday, the House, remember those moderates who are concerned about Medicaid cuts because they've been hearing a lot about it from constituents. On Tuesday, the House didn't have enough votes to put that bill, to put the blueprint on the House floor and get it passed. There were enough people behind the scenes that said, I can't vote for this. I can't stand and vote to approve this, that it kind of looked like we were in a place where maybe we would not see this move forward, which would have bought us more time. right? The Senate is still pursuing its own two-bill path, but again, more time gives you more opportunity to really talk with with lawmakers and make the case that this isn't a good idea. That changed on Wednesday because the president endorsed the House One Bill plan, which means he endorsed the spending cut levels, the $2 trillion spending cuts, and all of the cuts that were assigned to a certain committee. And that includes $880 billion in cuts that were assigned to the committee that oversees Medicaid. Lots of people at the national level feel like this puts a tremendous amount of pressure on those moderates who are uncomfortable with Medicaid cuts to accept the blueprint because they don't want to make the president angry with them. And the House, now that that one bill plan has been endorsed by the chief executive of the country, wants to push forward and set up a floor vote to make everybody in the House commit to at least that level of cuts that that is in the blueprint. So all of a sudden we're seeing a pretty rapid shift of maybe this one bill plan isn't going to go anywhere to, oh, this could be scheduled for a vote next week. And once the House commits to this blueprint, they are saying yes to cuts. So we have heard that some congressional folks are trying to tell constituents that, well, I can vote for the blueprint, but that doesn't guarantee any cuts. That's just saying, it's just me approving a plan and nothing's been decided yet. No, that is either a fundamental lack of understanding of how budget reconciliation works, or they are trying to say that to make you feel better, and they know exactly what this blueprint does, and that they know that vote means that they're committing to cuts, okay? So this document that they might approve next week, yes, it requires $2 trillion in cuts to fund $4.5 trillion in tax cuts. And it requires at least $880 billion in Medicaid cuts. And those cuts to Medicaid could be higher. So when you hear a legislator kind of trying to justify what their vote might be, you should read through that. Voting yes next week, if this bill goes to the floor, means that your lawmaker is voting yes to $2 trillion in cuts and a minimum probably of $880 billion in cuts to Medicaid. That blueprint commits the House to those cut targets as they have been written. There isn't negotiating about $880 billion in cuts that have been assigned to the committee. You're not trying to, you say it goes somewhere else. No, you are saying we absolutely are giving approval for these levels of cuts for these committees and allowing those cuts to be deeper if they need to be. And most people are, this is not new news. Most people who have been watching this issue over the last few months, when there are big numbers, it means Medicaid cuts, because Medicaid is the fourth largest thing that the government spends its money on. So you can make a lot of little cuts and you won't get near to $2 trillion. You can cut a lot of things and really not have a lot of savings to show for it. Or you can go to the big pot of money and cut there and get all the savings you need. So this is why folks are so concerned about Medicaid, because it is the big pot of money where if you just focus there, you can get up to $2 trillion much more quickly than if you make a lot of smaller cuts. This is not all bad news. I don't want you to think that any of this stuff is a conclusion. We lawmakers know that people are really watching them. And we've already gotten them nervous about what Medicaid cuts would mean in their districts. We've slowed this process down. We weren't supposed to be in this place at this point. We were told that this was already going to be happened and done, by the end of February. Well, it's almost the end of February and they haven't started the process yet. And that is all about people like yourselves who have been working really hard over the last several weeks to say, hey, I'm not sure this idea is a good idea. Now you have to turn on your critical thinking skills. Don't accept that any of this is going to happen. This is, again, like the tennis match. We hit a ball and they're hitting it back. And our job is not to sit there and watch the ball fall to the court. Our job is to run and hit the ball back so that it's in their court and they have to respond. People might want to tell you that these cuts are a certainty. They aren't. And lawmakers might want to tell you that there's nothing they could do, or that if they had to vote yes, or that their vote really doesn't mean that those cuts will happen at all, or I haven't seen the details yet, so I don't know what's happening. Or what Medicaid cuts? Nobody's talking about Medicaid cuts, even though the press has been since November. Lawmakers get to decide things. They are the people that you elected to make decisions that are the best for the district as a whole. This is a representative democracy, right? They make choices. They will be in the position to decide to approve or reject Medicaid cuts. And it's our job as citizens to influence those choices and make sure that we are holding them accountable for what choices they make. So our job collectively is to build on the work that we've already done. We've already made them uneasy. They already know that there are people concerned. And as the weeks go on, there's more and more and more reasons why Medicaid cuts will have a huge impact, not only on people's daily lives, but on the health and long-term care systems, on all of the people who get paid to do work for those systems, on unpaid caregivers who, if their person loses some amount of support, may have to step in and may have to step out of their jobs. You have been doing the work to say this has impact and the impact is not good. And our continual job is to make sure that voting yes to cut Medicaid is the hardest choice this lawmaker will ever have to make, and that it will have consequences. So, what to do about this? There are a couple very tangible asks in the next 3 to 4 days that are really important. And the best thing that could happen next week is that there are enough concerned moderate Republicans who say behind the scenes to I can't vote for this blueprint. I don't want you to put it on the floor because I don't want to have to vote up or down on it. I don't want to have to vote yes and then explain to my constituents who don't trust that my yes is a good thing. My best option is for you to not hold a vote on this bill. So that's the first ask. You ask your congressional reps to talk with their leadership who has the ability to decide whether or not a bill goes to the floor, and tell them, don't vote on this blueprint. Don't put this up for a vote. If the blueprint doesn't get a vote, the reconciliation process and cuts process never starts. This is the moment where if they can never get agreement on the level of cuts and what is in that plan, and they can't get 218 Republican members to vote for it, none of the cut process stops. Okay, so that's the first ask, and that would buy you time. That buys us time to continue to make sure legislators understand the consequences of cutting Medicaid. It's possible that the speaker schedules a vote on the blueprint. Sometimes they might schedule a vote knowing they don't have enough people willing to raise their hands and say yes to it in order to pressure those people into saying yes. And certainly if moderates who don't want to vote yes know that their speaker is calling the question, right, that there's going to be a public vote, and they know that the executive branch has said they support it, they're going to feel like they want to do one thing, but have to vote a different way. And you need to inspire courage in your lawmakers to say no. Courage is a really rare commodity in politics. But it could be that you have a lot of moderate Republicans who don't want to vote yes, who then feel pressured if there's a vote scheduled to have to not vote what they think and have to vote a different way than what their constituents want. If that happens, then the ask becomes, the vote is scheduled, it's a vote no on the blueprint. All you need is one or two Republican members to vote no, and that blueprint can't pass. We're not talking about having to move mountains here. We're talking about having to move a couple grains of sand. And then again, if that blueprint can't pass, this reconciliation process never starts. Okay, so those are two very solid asks that have just become really important based on how things happened 2 days ago. Lots of you have been making contacts with lawmakers. Lots of you have heard things that they have said. We've all been very polite because we're from Wisconsin and it's what we do. Now's the time to politely but firmly not allow any excuses. You are not alone. It may feel like you're alone, but you're not. There have been thousands of people just like you who have been talking to lawmakers about federal Medicaid cuts for weeks. There is absolutely no ability for lawmakers to say they didn't know. You have made that true. You have been talking to them about your concerns from a lot of different perspectives. It isn't only people who are reliant on receiving daily services from, say, Medicaid long-term care. It's also providers. It's also counties. It's also everyone who is being touched by Medicaid. And the number of people, as well as the different kinds of people that are expressing concerns, keeps growing. They know that that voting yes on the blueprint means Medicaid cuts will happen, even if that's not what they say. You need to be able to say to them, I know what your vote will mean. I'm watching how you vote. I will let everybody know how you vote, and I won't forget how you vote. So that's the House. Senator Johnson has a sign-up sheet for a telephone town hall. There's no date for it. There's no time, but we're encouraging people to register for it because at least you'll get notified when there is a date and time. And Senator Johnson has not had one of these, but I think it's an important opportunity for people across the state to use to really gain access to him and reinforce what we know his in-district offices have been hearing from constituents about Medicaid. So again, opportunity, rather low stakes action that you can take, but an important one, because the more people from across the state elevate these issues to Senator Johnson, I think the less ability that lawmaker has to say he hasn't heard about it or can dismiss those concerns. U.S. Senator Tammy Baldwin, remember, we still have a Senate that's moving forward on a two-bill reconciliation process. She serves on one of the committees that's been directed to find at least $171 billion in cuts. And the Health and Education Committee cover, that they have jurisdiction over Medicare and Medicaid, as well as all of the federal education funding. So she is in a position where there are things she can do in the near future to talk about and elevate issues from her constituents. One of the things that we keep hearing from lawmakers is, well, I haven't seen the details. Well, there's nothing really in writing. That's not entirely true because, obviously the ideas about what cuts to Medicaid are being considered have been out for quite some time, and they've been published. And, as to what's the menu of ideas that say the congressional budget committees have been considering. But it has been hard for constituents to be able to follow a process where a lot of it is happening behind the scenes and it hasn't been in print yet. This is a strategy. Folks need to understand this. This is a time-tested strategy of work out your issues behind the scenes before anything is introduced publicly. And by the time something is introduced publicly, there's already agreement by the lawmakers who have to vote on it. And people like you and I are seeing what the actual language is that would change law or would change spending for the first time. So it's time to start pushing back on that. If somebody tells you, well, I haven't seen the details yet, well, what do you know? Because it is not reasonable to assume that there's some lawmaker who's sitting around waiting for everyone else around them to do all the work and has no idea what's going on. Tammy Baldwin is in a position to help constituents know what is being talked about by this committee. She is probably not privy to the conversations about what cuts is this committee really considering, but she can play a really important role in helping constituents know in real time what's being discussed and how can people participate and what kinds of things can she get from constituents that will help tell the members of the committee what these proposals would do to real people. A lot of times senators will share constituent stories at public hearings or on the floor or other times. And that can be a really important way for folks to kind of tie, here's what this, policy means to real people's lives. And of course, since this is a committee that does oversee Medicaid and special education and also all of the disability and aging organizations, it's important to say to her, like, don't, watch for cuts in those areas and say no to them, okay? Spend a little time on this. The phrase fraud, waste, and abuse, and it's usually said just like that, where those three words are run right together. This keeps coming up in relation to Medicaid. And I've posted a little painful hearing. It's long. It's more than 2 hours. So, if you have other things to do in your day, know it's out there. But there's been a lot of coverage and actually just a statement this morning where lawmakers are kind of pivoting this assumption. There's no evidence to this, that there's just a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse in Medicaid. And I think we're going to be, doing some work to help people respond to this. But I think it's important for folks to know that lawmakers are saying there's a bunch of without evidence and without any numbers, that there's fraud, waste, and abuse in these programs. And they're implying that if we just stopped that, then we'd save Medicaid dollars and then we wouldn't have to cut programs. And I think that people should push back on that, right? First of all, when you're talking about a minimum of $880 billion in Medicaid cuts under the House Blueprint plan with another $500 billion potentially on top of that, there's not enough fraud, waste, and abuse, no matter how large, there's not enough fraud, waste, and abuse to reasonably, say that you are not cutting Medicaid. The amount of money that I just described, $880 billion, possibly more, that's about 27% of what the federal government spends on Medicaid. And there is not 27% of fraud, waste, and abuse in Medicaid. Like that is not anything that is real. The other important point to know is that fraud, waste, and abuse they might be used interchangeably, but they mean really different things. Fraud is somebody who is doing a criminal act and deliberately trying to get money that they don't deserve. Waste is kind of accidental. Fraud is a criminal activity that courts decide if it happened. Waste is kind of subjective. That can be up to the eye of the beholder. And so can abuse. And there's this other thing that keeps coming up called improper payments. Improper payments, which are the most of what is in this kind of category of fraud, waste, and abuse, are administrative mistakes. And about 77% of fraud, waste, and abuse stuff are actually improper payments, which doesn't mean that somebody's doing something that is illegal or that is fraudulent or that is wasteful or abusive. It means they made mistakes on their paperwork that need to be corrected. And you really, it isn't the same thing as trying to commit a criminal act. This public hearing, I put it on here because I think it gives you a good sense of some of the ways that outside interest groups and lawmakers are thinking about fraud, waste, and abuse. And I did read through some of the testimony that people provided for this hearing. And I think it's important to kind of know that there's one idea, which is there are people in Medicaid who shouldn't be there, right? That somehow there are people who are in these programs that don't belong there, that aren't eligible. That's kind of one angle of that. So that somebody, isn't low enough income or doesn't pass the functional screen. And I think that for a lot of us who know what it takes to be able to apply for and stay in Medicaid programs and all of the process that you have to go through, that kind of should be a red flag for us, because it isn't easy to get into Medicaid and stay in, but there is a rhetorical perspective that says we are providing health or long-term care coverage to people who don't qualify, who shouldn't get it. That's one angle. And the other angle is that somehow there are people in Medicaid who shouldn't that shouldn't be there, or that are getting something that they shouldn't be getting, right? That they are somehow getting services or getting paid for services that they shouldn't be. Most of the ideas that were presented to this committee really are about how to address fraud, waste, and abuse, aren't really about gathering better data or following up or doing something more than all of the states already have to do before they send payments to the federal government, and that the federal government has to do, because there's a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse protections and scrutiny in place. All of the ideas are really more about having the person who's applying to be in Medicaid have to do more, and having states do more to truly verify or set up other administrative processes that people have to do correctly in order to get in. That isn't, that is being lumped into ideas on ways to reduce fraud and abuse, but it's making an assumption that somehow the people in Medicaid are the ones committing the fraud. And that I don't think is true, especially given all of the process that's already in place to weed out people who do not meet the eligibility requirements. this is a big messaging point. So I think it'll be important in the coming weeks for us to kind of push back and talk about what is already happening. Medicaid is a huge program. There's trillions of dollars that are flowing around trying to pay people who are doing the work. Is there some amount of fraud, waste, and abuse? Yes, in a program of that scale, there's going to be somebody who doesn't do something correctly. So I don't think it's that there's no fraud, waste, and abuse, but it's also true that this is not rampant and of a scale where every single person in Medicaid should be scrutinized and assumed to be committing fraud, waste, and abuse. And I've put a couple of quotes on here of just things that lawmakers are saying to which there is no evidence and no way to verify. You know, when somebody is saying 50% of Medicaid spending is fraudulent or incompetent, that is so many, that is such a large amount of money that it's kind of inconceivable. And I don't think there's no evidence that half of what Medicaid spends its money on is wasteful, fraudulent, or abusive. And I think, you know, it'll be important to push back when you hear those kinds of things and ask tough questions. Like, where are you getting that information? Is it from the Office of Inspector General for Medicaid fraud? Because the federal government has one of those. You know, is it from, you know, any of the other federal agencies that are watchdogging for fraud? And if it's not, then you've got to ask, well, where's your source and what's your evidence? Because there may not be anything behind that statement. I threw a quick slide up here from a webinar that Georgetown put together in late January that was specifically on fraud, waste, and abuse. And I think it's just helpful to know that most of the time, things seem to be above board 95% of the time. And yes, there are a certain amount of improper payments, and you can see that a lot of those improper payments are mistakes. That red category, that is probably the amount that, okay, it's not a mistake, it could be waste, it could be fraud, but it's a pretty small part of that circle. So one thing that you can add to your messaging in the coming weeks, if you are an individual or a provider agency, and this is more about individuals, I don't think lawmakers understand what individuals or families have to do to apply for and prove their eligibility and verify that eligibility. How frequently do you have to do that? What do you need to do? We should not expect that they understand any of that process the way you do, because you have to actually do it. And I think if you sat down and you kind of wrote through all the steps and you wrote through, like, here are the documents that I have to have in order, and here, you know, is what I have to do by a certain time, and here are the forms, like, it would be eye-opening for lawmakers to know what do you have to do in order to qualify and be, you know, said, okay, you can get into Medicaid. And for some people with disabilities, that also means functional screens, and, you know, that you have to keep doing in order to stay eligible for, say, like family care or IRIS. For providers, I think this is going to be really critical message for providers. I hear from providers that they find the process of getting reimbursed by Medicaid to be difficult now. I don't think lawmakers necessarily know that. And you are in a great position to be able to again say, like, hey, in order to make sure my workers get paid for work that they've already done, here's the process that I have to go through all the time. I mean, it is a part of your administrative overhead to complete the paperwork accurately and quickly on a time level where you can get reimbursed and have that money to cover your operating costs. The state has a lot of evaluation of reimbursements. You could talk about what it means if there's a mistake they flag and how much time it takes to correct that and get it approved, and what does that mean for potentially delaying payments. You can talk about how if you don't do things correctly, what are the consequences? Because there are consequences for providers who are making mistakes or doing something that is considered fraudulent or abusive or wasteful. I don't think that lawmakers know what those things are right now. I also think it's really important for lawmakers to understand how important it is for providers to be doing all of this administrative work burden correctly, and what it means if they don't, right? One of the things that we've been thinking about is for many providers, Medicaid might be the only source of funding that keeps the business going, or it may be a significant portion. And a significant portion can mean something less than 50%, right? So, when you're thinking about Medicaid as a source of money to pay your employees and do the work that you do, it doesn't take a lot of disruption for that to affect whether or not your business can continue. And one other thing is that many providers are providing services for both Medicaid and non-Medicaid patients, but Medicaid as part of their budget is an extremely needed to keep the whole business running. So if you end up in a situation where you're not getting reimbursed for work you've already done in a timely manner, that cash flow is disrupted. It not only disrupts service for Medicaid patients, it also disrupts potentially services for people who are not on Medicaid. Because if your business viability is not solid, because some of the amount of money you rely on for your operating budget is not coming in when it needs to, that jeopardizes the operation of the whole business. And I think that's a message that lawmakers don't quite understand. Obviously, if your business is solely funded by Medicaid, those consequences happen very quickly, but it doesn't mean that there are no consequences for providers who accept both Medicaid and private pay or different kinds of insurance. These are things that when we're talking about fraud, waste, and abuse, it's not only important to know for them to understand how much scrutiny there is already, but what are the consequences to businesses if they do make mistakes, and that there's a real incentive to do things correctly and above board, because it threatens the operation of the entire business. Okay, so what can we do in state? Disability Advocacy Day is coming up March 12th. This can be an important opportunity to sit down with your state senator and state legislator. Remember, if these Medicaid cuts happen at the federal level, our state legislators get handed a bag of bad decisions that they have to make. So it's an important opportunity. We have about 600 spots. And if you are able to go, registration is free, but we are going to ask that if you register, you have to plan that you absolutely will attend. We do a lot of work to set up appointments with legislators, and they are provided your names before you get there. So if you don't show up, they know your name, and they know that you were supposed to be there and you weren't, and that is not a great impression for the importance of disability issues. So anyway, 600 spots, the registration link is there, and it's going to be an important opportunity to really help legislators understand what does Medicaid do in your daily lives and why they should be really concerned and working against federal Medicaid cuts. We have a number of volunteers who are coordinating groups by congressional district. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the activities that folks have done this week with these groups, If you are interested in being connected with other doers in your district, if you are somebody who wants to be invited when somebody decides to go and meet with their in-district, office, or that, you want to be included if there's a press interview or something else, there's lots of local work that folks are doing, and this is a great way to get connected. So if you know your congressional rep, and I have them all listed here, there's a Facebook page for each district that you can ask to join, and kind of start getting connected to other people in your district who are working on these issues, and contributing, as you can, with the work they're trying to do. We got in the news this week. So news is always good because that provides content that you can share with your networks of folks, not only disability folks, but other people, that in your life beyond disability. There are still a lot of people in the wider community who are hearing about Medicaid cuts for the first time, and people need to hear about things many times before they kind of understand what's real. So every news story that you get becomes more content to help other people understand that this is real and that this is happening and that this is something that they should be watching. Lisa Davidson, who works for the trade association that represents assisted living and nursing homes, and I did about a half-hour news spot on Wisconsin Eye, which is kind of Wisconsin's version of C-SPAN. This week specifically focused on Medicaid cuts and how it would impact long-term care. So you can watch that and you can share that. We have a picture here I got yesterday. Some great work in District 3, maybe, with Representative Derek Van Orton. They had a meeting yesterday. Again, one of these volunteer district groups, lots of in-district meetings, lots of activity this week. Here's a picture of almost 40 people who showed up to an in-district meeting talking about Medicaid and impact on disability. And I will share with you that when the person said, hey, I want to do this, I think I could get 2 or 3 people to come with me. Nope, she got almost 40, because this is an issue that is really top of mind for a lot of people. And that's something for you to remember too. Like, if you feel like you're alone in this, you're not. A lot of times people are waiting to be asked. So one important action step that everyone can take is to make sure that you offer, or you connect, or you reach out and ask somebody if they want to come with you. Because the answer might be yes. Go from 3 people coming to a meeting to 40, and look at how much of an impact and an impression that makes on that representative staff. There were a couple of activities that the volunteer grassroots folks did in District 8. District 8, lots of people had been trying to connect with that congressman, but weren't getting much success. And we kind of talked about that last week, where they were making calls and making meeting requests and making, email requests, and there wasn't any response. So this local group of advocates said, well, we're going to show up at the district office, and here's a place and a time, and they got a group of people together, and they contacted the press ahead of time and said, look, we have been trying very hard to get in touch with this representative, and we've gotten no response back. We're going to talk about Medicaid cuts and what it would mean to our lives, and here's where we're going to be. Press, come with us. And they did. And here are a couple articles that were the result of that activity. Again, things that you can share. And I think that one article is a few things that factually are not quite correct, but they both really elevated the individual people who were there and why they were there. So the quotes that they took from people who were speaking were really good. And those are the things that you promote, like the sentence or two of some concerned citizen who has taken the time to show up during the day at somebody's office because they weren't being listened to is really powerful. County resolution work is slow. It goes through a process, but we have 4 counties that are actively moving resolutions opposing Medicaid cuts that are moving. Again, if this is something where you have county connections, we've heard a couple of people talk about their counties getting very, very nervous and kind of calculating how much Medicaid dollars come into their county. Well, if you hear that from a county worker, ask the question, would you help us pass a resolution? Like, you should be public about and on record about what is the impact of Medicaid cuts to the county and opposing those impacts. So we have 4 counties that are in the process of doing resolutions. There can be others. And I think the more counties do that, the more powerful it becomes, as it's harder to ignore for our representatives across the state. There was also an article this week about Wausau is in Marathon County, passing a resolution that opposed Medicaid cuts. So, there are various local governments that are starting to talk about these issues, starting to think about how would this impact our community, our healthcare, our long-term care systems. And all of these little things seem small in and of themselves, but when you start adding it up, it is really powerful. All of these little actions do matter. And as much as all of us can encourage and support people to do something, that becomes part of the larger picture of, yeah, pretty much there's agreement that these things are not a good idea for our state. Last week, Democratic state legislators, so our state senators, Democratic senators and state Democratic assembly folks, they sent a letter to the congressional delegation, and were very clear. And they sent a press release out. So this is the press release they sent out. But they sent a fairly detailed, strongly worded letter that said, hey, Medicaid cuts are not a good idea for our state or for our communities. They're going to hurt, the economy, the state budget, all the people who rely on Medicaid, all the people who get paid by Medicaid. Pretty strong message. So if your legislator signed on, now you've got an opportunity to thank them for that. And if they were a Democratic legislator that they did sign on, because it was only Democrats that signed on to the letter. It's a great way to do one little action. Again, follow up with your state senator or state representative who signed on, thank them, ask what else they're doing planning to do to prevent Medicaid cuts, offer to help. Again, connecting legislators with more of their constituents who are affected by these cuts is always a great idea, because they may want to do a press event with you. They may want to talk more about what Medicaid means to your life. And they may be able to say things like, hey, I'm getting called by many constituents about this same issue. It gives them the ability to authentically say, this is a concern I'm hearing about. If you never contact them, then they never hear about it. So it's an important step to take. If your legislator didn't sign on to the letter, it's another opportunity to kind of say, hey, this is important to me. And, can I connect you with other people in your district who it's important to? And you can always ask them, can you do something similar? Can you make a case on our behalf to our congressional district that you do not want to see federal Medicaid cuts happen that mean that the state has to cut Medicaid at our state level? That's a reasonable ask to make. And the only reason I include the next slide is because here's one action, right? They wrote a letter, they sent it to Congress, they wrote a press release. The press release went out to the media, and here's another story that happened specifically because of that press release. So again, thinking about how you continue to build momentum. You have a pebble, you put it on top of the hill, it starts rolling down, and all of a sudden you've got a snowball effect. And that is a real powerful thing that many of you are part of right now and can continue doing. Yep, that one action, but it led to another action, and it led to some more content that is shareable, and it helps build the messaging around Medicaid cuts are top of mind and people are worried about them. Next week, we're going to have a sheet that's coming out that will help folks explain who's in Medicaid in their county, how many providers are in their county, and how much Medicaid dollars are going into their county. We're almost ready. I think that'll be a very powerful message that will be really good timing for a potential prevention of a vote on the House blueprint that would mean a lot of Medicaid cuts, or another thing to share that will really make the case that, hey, these cuts really do have an impact on an awful lot of people locally in a real way. I'm almost done. You're all very polite Wisconsin people. Don't wait for permission anymore. I know that's hard. You need to be present and persistent. You can be polite. You don't need to be rude. But I think the time for firmness is here. Lawmakers have been hearing a lot from people just like you about Medicaid cuts. They're not used to being challenged. They need to be challenged. And we are here to help you figure out like what questions to ask. It's your job to make sure you ask the questions and that you don't accept easy answers and that you're asking more questions. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, if these cuts happen, they will impact you directly in a way that maybe that isn't true for a lawmaker right now. And I think that helps you say authentically, I'm asking you these questions because they directly impact what my life might look like in the future. I always put this thing here. All you got to do is a few things. You don't have to do everything. Know that lots of other people are doing things too. And as much as you can help them do those things and can encourage more people to take more actions, I think the more momentum we're going to be able to build on these issues. We're in it for the long haul, kids. This is not going to be over next week. It is not going to be over the week after next. But just like in 2017, we had several months of very, very hard work that ended up with a win. And I think that's what we're trying to do this time as well. All right, I'm going to stop now. And if there are any questions, we can take them.